Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We'll now begin. Story 1, The Spark in Palermo, Sicily's Forgotten Fight for Autonomy. On the morning of January 12, 1848, the streets of Palermo did not erupt with thunder. There were no grand declarations, no trumpets, just a warm winter breeze, a church bell's faint echo, and the quiet tension of revolution rising from beneath the cobbled stones. The uprising in Sicily began, quite literally, at the edge of boredom. It was a calm revolt, born not from sudden rage but from festering frustration and a deeply bureaucratic sense of injustice. The kingdom of the two Sicilies, ruled from Naples under the Bourbon monarch Ferdinand II, had long kept a loose and dismissive hold over the island. Sicily had been treated as a province, not a partner a pawn to extract taxes and obedience, but rarely attention or reform. But beneath the indifference, something old stirred. A memory, perhaps. Sicily had once been semi-autonomous, even had its own parliament in 1812, only to see it dissolved by the centralizing ambitions of Naples. The nobles still remembered. So did the lawyers, the clergy, and the bourgeois professionals who handled the tedious management of local affairs. In the weeks leading up to the revolt, Sicilian notables had gathered in private salons and backrooms, poring over dusty constitutional documents from decades prior. This wasn't a revolution driven by fiery speeches, but by pamphlets, old ones, forgotten ones. The 1812 Constitution became their Bible not because it was radical, but precisely because it was. It represented a return to order, not a leap into chaos. The organizers planned the uprising carefully. They didn't want to topple the Bourbon monarchy entirely. They wanted to restore the Sicilian parliament and gain a degree of autonomy. On the surface, their demands were mild. But history, of course, is often not moved by how things begin, but by how they unravel. When the people of Palermo rose, they weren't merely rising for an abstract ideal. They were rising because the price of bread had risen by more than 30% over the past year. They were rising because land reform had stalled and feudal dues lingered in practice, if not in law. They were rising because the gendarmes, ill-paid and often drunk, had become more threatening than protecting. They were rising, too, because they had nothing better to do. Much of the population in Palermo were artisans or underemployed laborers. Few owned property. Many had long, idle days. Revolt provided a purpose, a structure, a strange sense of camaraderie in the streets. When the first shots were fired in the Vucciria market district, the uprising spread with quiet efficiency. Militiamen from previous insurrections emerged from obscurity, and young men built barricades with wooden crates and furniture. Church bells began ringing not in panic, but in rhythm. The Bourbon forces in Palermo, caught unprepared and poorly led, fell back. Their officers had assumed the island was pacified, if not placid. It was neither. Within 48 hours, most of the city had slipped from their grasp. But this was not a riot. It was a reclamation. A provisional committee formed, composed largely of older aristocrats, judges, and professors. They dusted off the language of 1812 with the excitement of archivists discovering a lost scroll. By January 20, less than a week after the uprising began, a new government had declared itself in Palermo. But was it a government or a memory? The re-establishment of the 1812 Constitution seemed quaint to some. It was a relic from a British-inspired moment in Sicilian history, a brief parliamentary period that had tried to modernize governance but was drowned out by continental absolutism. To restore it in 1848 was almost romantic, and therein lay the danger. Beyond Palermo, Sicilian towns responded slowly. Some joined the revolt, others hesitated, still others awaited Naples' response. The countryside remained largely under the control of local landlords, many of whom were indifferent or suspicious of liberal ideas. The committee in Palermo began to realize that revolution is easiest in the abstract, and hardest when it must fill potholes or pay soldiers. And yet, for all its uncertainties, the January uprising was the first true revolution of 1848. It came not from Paris, nor Berlin, nor Vienna, but from the dusty island that had long been forgotten by European power politics. And in doing so, it sparked something larger than itself. Newspapers in Milan, Paris, and even London began to whisper about the Sicilian flame. Exiles and dreamers watched Palermo with renewed hope. If Sicily could rise, perhaps others could too. Still, beneath the rhetoric and reform, old problems endured. The provisional government lacked resources. Naples was preparing to retaliate, and not everyone in Sicily agreed on what came next. Would the revolution remain a polite, constitutionalist rebellion, or would it deepen into something more radical, more unpredictable, and perhaps more divisive? The people of Palermo had taken the first step, but the road beyond was shrouded in dust and doubt. When the provisional government in Palermo declared the re-establishment of the 1812 Constitution, they did not expect silence in return. And yet, silence interrupted only by uncertainty and slow-moving logistics was exactly what they received. The revolution had succeeded in claiming the city, but that was merely the opening act. Now came the burden of governing. By early February 1848, the restored Sicilian parliament convened in Palermo. It was a curious blend of the old and the hopeful, aging aristocrats, cautious lawyers, and a smattering of reform-minded professionals. There was a shared respect for procedure. Meetings opened with prayers and closed with excessive paperwork. Debates revolved around protocol. And yet beneath this ceremonial calm, the real challenges pressed in. The problem was twofold: geography and economics. Most of the island was still outside direct control of the new government. In cities like Catania and Messina, loyalties wavered. The Bourbon monarchy had not given up Sicily, it had merely lost it for the moment. Naples was watching, waiting, and organizing. Meanwhile, in the countryside, landlords maintained a kind of informal rule through client networks and brute authority. The revolutionaries in Palermo had no army to speak of, and their militia volunteers with muskets and little training were ill-suited for complex operations. Economically, Sicily had been stagnating for decades. Agriculture was dominant but inefficient. The land remained locked in a semi-feudal system, with large estates, latifundia, operated by absentee landlords and worked by peasants whose lives had changed little since the Middle Ages. Crop yields were low, infrastructure was poor, and trade had been suppressed under Bourbon rule. Palermo, like many Sicilian cities, relied heavily on imported grain. Prices were still high, and food insecurity remained a constant threat. In response, the parliament formed committees, one for taxation, another for military organization, a third for internal reform. But the bureaucracy moved slowly, and Palermo's patience, so bold in January, began to fray by March. What the people wanted was clear: bread prices to stabilize, the militia to be professionalized, land reform to begin, the monarchy to stay away. What they received instead were discussions. The parliament debated whether to ask Britain for support. It debated the extent to which the restored constitution should be amended. It debated who qualified as a citizen. It debated the nature of Sicilian identity itself. In that sense, the parliament was not entirely unlike its counterparts across Europe. Everywhere in 1848, revolutionary governments struggled not with ideas but with administration. To rebel was thrilling. To govern was exhausting. Still, the provisional government did achieve something remarkable. It remained intact. Messina and Catania eventually joined the movement, albeit cautiously. A modest military was formed, led by General Carlo Filangieri, a Neapolitan defector with a history of moderate liberal sympathies. He organized a defense force out of militias and old soldiers, drawing maps, drilling battalions, and issuing orders on paper that rarely translated to field effectiveness. By mid-spring, Sicily was under the control of the revolutionary government. Naples had withdrawn entirely. Ferdinand II, humiliated and distracted by unrest on the mainland, turned his attention to the collapsing order in Naples and the growing demands for a constitution from his own subjects. In April, he conceded a constitution was proclaimed for the entire kingdom of the Two Sicilies. At first glance, this seemed like a victory for the Sicilian cause. But in Palermo, the news was met with suspicion. The revolution had not been fought to secure a constitution under Bourbon control, but to restore Sicilian autonomy. The idea of a unified constitutional monarchy might appeal to Neapolitan liberals, but for Sicilians, it felt like a trap. This divergence exposed an important historical fault line. Liberalism and nationalism did not always align. The Sicilians were not rebelling purely for abstract rights. They wanted separation. They wanted to govern themselves. A key moment arrived in May when the Parliament in Palermo declared the full independence of Sicily from Naples. Ferdinand II was officially deposed. A regent was appointed in his place, Ruggero Settimo, a naval officer and cautious reformer. He was moderate, well-respected, and decidedly uncharismatic, but he brought something Sicily needed: stability. Under Settimo's direction, the new government tried to formalize its statehood. It minted coins, established diplomatic missions, and opened trade negotiations with Britain and France. Some success followed. British merchants, ever opportunistic, began dealing more freely with Sicilian ports. Liberal circles in London and Paris wrote approvingly of the Sicilian experiment. Yet problems lingered. First, the land question. Peasants, who had risen enthusiastically in some parts of the island, expected redistribution. They believed the revolution would bring an end to centuries of landlord control, but Parliament was dominated by those very landlords or their legal representatives. Land reform bills were proposed, debated, and shelved. Violence flared in rural areas, often blamed on bandits, though many were simply dispossessed workers demanding promises be kept. Second, the army. Filangieri's forces were loyal but small. Desertion was common. Ammunition was scarce. Naples had begun rebuilding its own forces. The momentary breathing room granted by the king's constitutional concession was closing fast. Third, the public mood. Revolutionary optimism had curdled into everyday complaint. Streets were cleaner, yes, and taxes slightly lower, but bread was still expensive. Jobs were still rare. Rumors circulated about secret negotiations between Naples and foreign powers to retake the island. Tension was rising, slowly but steadily. In late summer, the Parliament proposed a referendum to affirm the island's full independence. Turnout was high. Approval was overwhelming. But votes, no matter how symbolic, do not deter armies. In Naples, Ferdinand II had recovered politically. He had dissolved his own parliament, dismissed liberal ministers, and declared the new constitution void. With order slowly reasserting itself on the mainland, the king now turned his attention southward. The expedition to reclaim Sicily was planned with methodical cruelty. By autumn, whispers of troop movements reached Palermo. Letters from the mainland warned of gathering fleets. The revolutionary government responded with calls for unity, patriotic speeches, and new taxes. A final attempt was made to reach out to Britain and France. Perhaps, it was hoped, the major powers would not allow such a bold constitutional experiment to be crushed. But European diplomacy was fickle. France was preoccupied with its own revolution and internal fractures. Britain, while sympathetic, refused to intervene militarily. Sicily, in the cold light of foreign policy, was not a priority. The Parliament's final debates in November were marked by a tone of weary defiance. Ministers clashed over military tactics. Citizens formed neighborhood watch groups, anticipating invasion. The churches held services for the Republic. And Filangieri, though no longer young, tightened the island's defenses with professional efficiency. But he knew better than anyone that Sicily could not stand alone. And so, as winter approached, a question settled over Palermo like the fog that rolled off the hills at dusk. How long could an island govern itself when the world around it remained indifferent, and the enemy was regaining its strength? The winter of 1848-1849 was not especially harsh in Sicily, but it carried the chill of anticipation. In Palermo, the cafes still bustled with subdued conversation. The Parliament still met under chandeliers lit by sputtering candles, and newspapers continued to print patriotic essays. But everyone, merchants, peasants, and ministers alike, knew that the revolution was nearing a crossroads. The return of force. By December, Ferdinand II, known by his critics as King Bomba, had finished consolidating power in Naples. The constitution he had granted earlier that year had been revoked, his parliament dissolved, liberal leaders arrested or exiled. Order, if one could call it, that had returned to the mainland under the weight of martial law. Sicily had once been a sideshow in the king's broader crisis. Now it was the focus. The Sicilian revolutionary government, led by Ruggero Settimo, had hoped their declaration of independence and constitutional governance would be enough to earn them protection. Their diplomats had petitioned London, Paris, and even Vienna. But the European powers, reeling from their own 1848 revolutions, had grown weary of reform. France had just established its Second Republic, and its attention was fixed inward. Britain remained aloof, practicing a cold neutrality. Austria, once hesitant, now eyed the restoration of order across the Italian peninsula as a necessity. Thus Sicily stood alone. In January 1849, the Bourbon army began its offensive. The king appointed General Carlo Filangieri, not the same defector who had served the Sicilian Revolution, but his namesake son and loyalist, to lead the campaign. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Filangieri was not a reactionary brute. He was a seasoned commander, a rationalist, and a patient tactician. But he was also determined. He would restore Bourbon rule with a mix of precision, diplomacy, and, if necessary, devastating force. The invasion of Messina. Messina was the first to fall. The northeastern city, strategically located across from the Calabrian coast, had long been a potential landing point for any Neapolitan return. Despite fortifications and militia presence, the city's defenses proved brittle. In early September 1848, months before the final campaign, Filangieri's troops bombarded Messina for 6 days. The attack earned the king his nickname, Bomba. The term wasn't used with affection. Entire districts were reduced to rubble. The civilian death toll was high. Though Messina surrendered, the bombardment was a warning to Palermo and the rest of the island. This would not be a negotiated return. This would be conquest. And so the revolution began to fray. Cracks in the movement. The unity that had held Palermo together through the early months of 1848 began to disintegrate. The parliament grew divided. Some members argued for unconditional resistance, even if it meant guerrilla war in the countryside. Others, more conservative, pushed for negotiation, perhaps a federal solution, or a return to autonomy under a less centralized monarchy. The people, too, were growing tired. Bread was scarce. The island's economy, already weak, was strangled by trade blockades and war-related disruption. Banditry rose in the hills, and peasant revolts broke out not against Naples, but against landowners who had failed to deliver on promises of reform. The revolution had begun with the illusion of unity. Now that illusion dissolved under the pressure of fear. Ruggero Settimo, ever the moderate, continued to call for patience and diplomacy. He even floated the idea of offering Sicily's crown to a foreign noble, perhaps a younger son of a European monarch who might serve as a neutral constitutional king. The idea failed to gain traction. It felt desperate, because it was. Palermo under siege. By April 1849, Bourbon forces had reached the outskirts of Palermo. Filangieri approached cautiously, mindful of the city's dense layout and the possibility of protracted street fighting. But resistance had already been weakened. The Revolutionary Army was undersupplied, its commanders unsure. Some units held firm, but many others surrendered or retreated without orders. The bombardment of Palermo was less severe than that of Messina, but no less symbolic. In mid-May, the city capitulated. Filangieri entered not as a butcher but as a restorer. He allowed churches to reopen, spared many civic buildings, and offered amnesty to lesser revolutionaries. Yet his message was clear. The king had returned. Sicilian independence was no more. Ruggero Settimo and several of his ministers fled first to Malta, then to Paris. The parliament was dissolved. The Constitution of 1812 permanently shelved. The last echoes of Sicilian self-rule faded beneath the sound of marching boots and the crack of Bourbon muskets. The aftermath. Sicily would remain under Bourbon control until the arrival of Garibaldi and the unification of Italy more than a decade later. But the memory of 1848 would linger quietly, unspoken but persistent. Many of those who had served in the revolutionary government would go on to participate in later liberal movements. Some would join Garibaldi's Red Shirts. Others would retreat into private life, writing memoirs or legal treatises about that brief year of possibility. And yet one could ask, did the Sicilian Revolution fail? On the surface, yes. Its government was overthrown, its constitution discarded, its hopes drowned in artillery smoke. But in a broader sense, perhaps not. The uprising in Palermo was the first domino in the great cascade of 1848. It demonstrated that even the most peripheral, neglected corner of Europe could ignite political imagination. It showed that demands for local control, legal autonomy, and constitutional rule were not just elite ideals but popular ones, rooted in everyday grievances. Moreover, it revealed the limits of revolution. That ideology alone, however noble, was not enough. Without bread, unity, or arms, hope collapses. And yet, without hope, history does not move at all. The Sicilian Revolution did not change the world, but it reminded it that change was possible. And perhaps that quiet memory was its most enduring legacy. Story 2: Metternich's Fall, the quiet collapse of the Austrian order. On March 13, 1848, Prince Clemens Wenzel von Metternich, once the most powerful diplomat in Europe, sat at his desk in the Hofburg Palace, surrounded by silence. Outside, Vienna trembled with protest. Inside, the old order began to crack. But the collapse of Metternich's influence wasn't sudden. It had been eroding slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the chipping of stone from a statue in a courtyard few people still visited. To understand why, we must begin not in 1848 but decades earlier, in the aftermath of Napoleon's fall. Metternich had not merely influenced the Congress of Vienna in 1815, he had orchestrated it. He envisioned a Europe of balance, stability, and control, not democracy, not revolution, certainly not nationalism. His system, sometimes called the Concert of Europe, functioned less like a symphony and more like an elaborate bureaucratic dance. Treaties were negotiated with the care of a cathedral's architecture. Revolts were suppressed like house fires, and diplomacy became a tool not for progress but for paralysis. Austria under Metternich's system was to be the keystone in a stable arch of monarchies. The Habsburg Empire, a polyglot collection of Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Italians, and more, held together by dynasty and inertia, was to be preserved through careful equilibrium. That meant liberalism had to be curtailed, nationalism had to be denied, freedom of the press, dangerous, constitutionalism, disruptive, student movements, monitored and infiltrated. The empire was to be protected not by its people's love but by the suppression of their demands. And for over 30 years it worked. But by 1848, the cracks had become impossible to ignore. The exhaustion of control. The Europe that Metternich had helped create no longer existed. Industrialization, though slower in Austria than in Britain or France, had begun to reshape society. The old guilds were breaking down. Railroads were carving through the countryside. A new urban class, artisans, clerks, merchants, and the newly poor had emerged, crowding into cities like Vienna, where rents rose faster than wages and food prices outpaced earnings. Meanwhile, the printing press, once shackled by censorship, was evolving. Secret journals passed hand to hand. Illegal newspapers printed in Leipzig or Zurich found their way to Prague and Trieste. The air was thick with ideas. And the people were tired of surveillance. The infamous Austrian police network, admired by absolutists and loathed by liberals, had eyes everywhere. But its reach had bred resentment. Political conversation moved underground, but it never ceased. Men like Lajos Kossuth in Hungary and Milan's intellectuals in Lombardy, Venetia, began to stir. Even within the imperial bureaucracy, a quiet unease was growing. Younger civil servants, trained in law and philosophy, felt torn between obedience and conscience. The very people Metternich had educated to uphold the state were beginning to question it. Metternich himself seemed increasingly out of touch. Still brilliant, still sharp, but isolated. He believed liberalism was a disease, nationalism a poison. His letters to foreign ministers still preached order and stability, but they read like sermons delivered to empty pews. The spark from Paris. Then came February 1848, and news from France. King Louis-Philippe, the so-called citizen king, had been overthrown. A new republic declared. The ripple was instant. Across Europe, eyes turned toward Paris not in admiration necessarily, but in calculation. If a seemingly stable monarchy could fall in days, what about others? In Vienna, the news electrified the city's restless students and emboldened the opposition. Pamphlets circulated again. Petitions began appearing at ministries. Political clubs met more openly. The walls of silence were beginning to crumble. On March 13, Vienna erupted. Thousands gathered in the streets. What began as a student protest grew rapidly. Artisans joined. Clerks followed. They marched past the Hofburg, shouting for a constitution, for press freedom, for reform. Some demanded Metternich's resignation outright. The police fired warning shots, then live rounds. That decision, so common in Metternich's long career of suppression, proved fatal. The crowd surged. Barricades were raised. The army hesitated. Some regiments refused to fire on civilians. The machinery of control that had functioned so precisely began to jam. Metternich's own advisors told him it was time to go. By nightfall, he had resigned. He fled the city the next morning, disguised in a cloak and hat, slipping out of a back entrance of the palace. He would not return. The symbol of conservatism, the architect of the post-Napoleonic world, was gone. Vienna without Metternich. At first, celebration. The resignation was met with cheers. Students embraced in the streets. Newspapers declared a new era. The government scrambled to form a new ministry, more liberal in appearance. Censorship was lifted briefly, and a wave of publications surged forward. The public read freely for the first time in decades. But beneath the euphoria, confusion brewed. What came next? Metternich had been the state's spine. Without him, Austria's imperial government was left with flailing limbs and no central nervous system. The Emperor Ferdinand I was considered a gentle man but politically inept. His ministers were divided. Some wanted to restore order quickly. Others saw a chance for real constitutional reform. No one was in charge. The empire's diverse population sensed an opportunity. In Prague, Czech leaders began organizing for greater autonomy. In Budapest, the Hungarians demanded their own parliament. In Milan and Venice, Italian nationalists rose in open rebellion. Austria was fragmenting not just politically, but conceptually. Could an empire built on silence survive in an age of shouting? Could a monarchy born of dynasties survive in an age of peoplehood? Metternich had always believed the answer was no. That was why he worked so hard to prevent the question from ever being asked. But now it had been. And as Europe entered the revolutionary spring of 1848, the Habsburg Empire, long considered the immovable center of European conservatism, found itself reeling. And Vienna, its imperial capital, would soon discover that removing one man did not remove the crisis. In fact, it may have only just begun. The departure of Prince Metternich from Vienna on March 14, 1848, was received not with grief but with relief. Across the empire, liberal newspapers declared the tyranny of secrecy over. In the cafes of Vienna, conversations that once occurred in whispers were now shouted across rooms. And for a moment, a brief, euphoric moment, it seemed as though the Habsburg Empire might transform itself peacefully. But revolutions, like tides, don't settle calmly. They surge, recede, and often return with greater force. A city rediscovers its voice. With censorship officially abolished in the weeks following Metternich's flight, the Austrian press exploded. Over 80 newspapers were founded in a matter of weeks: satirical journals, constitutional digests, radical pamphlets, workers' newsletters, and student bulletins. What had been a political desert became a jungle of voices, each with different ideas of what a post-Metternich Austria should be. Students and workers, emboldened by the March protests, formed the Academic Legion, a volunteer militia of young men in black uniforms, drilling in university courtyards and patrolling the streets of Vienna. Ostensibly a civic guard, the Legion quickly became a political force in its own right. They were organized, idealistic, and impatient. In April, the Emperor Ferdinand I, kindly and largely out of touch, was persuaded by his ministers to issue a constitutional charter, granting civil rights, a representative assembly, and trial by jury. Liberals cheered. But the document was vague. It spoke in generalities and contained several clauses that preserved imperial privilege. To many, this looked like a facade. The old order, they believed, was merely changing clothes. The streets remained filled with demonstrators. Clerks and tailors now marched beside printers and teachers, waving banners that read "Freedom for all peoples" and "Down with absolutism." But the problem was not the lack of revolution, it was the surplus of them. A multinational empire in motion. Austria in 1848 was a patchwork of languages, religions, and identities. What Metternich had held together through repression, censorship, and imperial prestige now threatened to fly apart. In Hungary, Lajos Kossuth delivered electrifying speeches calling for full autonomy and a national assembly. His popularity was immense, and on March 15, mass protests in Pest led to the formation of a Hungarian government. Though nominally loyal to the emperor, it behaved increasingly like an independent state. In Bohemia, Czech intellectuals demanded recognition of Slavic culture and language, a sharp departure from decades of Germanization policies. In May, the Prague Slavic Congress was called a gathering of representatives from across Slavic regions to discuss their place in the empire. It was a bold and symbolic act. In Lombardy, Venetia, the Habsburg-controlled Italian provinces, revolts exploded. Milan saw 5 days of barricade fighting in March, the famous Cinque Giorni, which drove out Austrian troops temporarily. Venice declared a republic under Daniel Manin. These were not marginal events. They were centrifugal forces, pulling the empire outward at every seam. The Viennese liberals watched these developments with both hope and fear. Many supported autonomy in principle, but worried it might fracture the empire. What they wanted was a federated Austria, where nationalities could coexist under a liberal constitution. But the model was vague and trust was scarce. The emperor and the cabinet of shadows. Behind the scenes, a quieter reaction was already beginning. After Metternich's fall, governance had passed to a rotating cast of ministers, men like Count Franz Stadion and Baron Pillersdorf. They were liberals of a sort, cautious reformers rather than radicals. But they were also increasingly isolated. The bureaucracy, long trained for obedience, found itself without clear instructions. The army, deeply conservative and multilingual, looked on the street movements with suspicion. The emperor remained passive, prone to confusion and needing constant guidance. Meanwhile, the imperial family was watching. Archduchess Sophie, Ferdinand's sister-in-law and a formidable political actor, had long distrusted liberalism. She had begun encouraging her son, Archduke Franz Joseph, to prepare for a role in shaping the future of Austria perhaps sooner than anyone expected. Thus, by the summer of 1848, Vienna was governed not only by a constitutional ministry, but by shadowy actors behind palace doors, those who sought to restore imperial authority under a more decisive hand. And outside those doors, the mood was darkening. The June crisis. In June, workers in Vienna organized strikes and new demonstrations. The price of bread was still high, unemployment had worsened, and the promised constitutional assembly had stalled. The academic legion, once idealistic, now patrolled the city like a revolutionary guard. Armed confrontations between soldiers and civilians grew more common. Then came the flashpoint. In Prague, Czech nationalist demonstrations turned violent. The Austrian army under General Windischgrätz moved in and crushed the rebellion by mid-June. The Slavic Congress was dispersed, the city placed under martial law. To the empire it was a necessary act, to the liberals it was betrayal. Vienna trembled again. On the 23rd of July, the first Austrian Reichstag, or imperial parliament, finally convened. It was revolutionary in structure. Delegates from across the empire, including peasants and professionals, met in a repurposed palace. Their task, to write a constitution. But the debates dragged. Slavic, German, Hungarian, and Italian delegates clashed over language rights, voting systems, and the structure of the state. Nothing was simple, everything was urgent. And outside the chamber, conservative forces were regathering. The return of reaction. By September it was clear, Vienna was slipping into chaos. Hungary was on the brink of full secession. Croatia, led by Ban Josip Jelačić, refused to recognize the new Hungarian government and pledged loyalty to the emperor instead. Austrian forces were preparing to move against Hungary, but needed to pass through Vienna. The population, sympathetic to the Hungarian cause, resisted. Then on October 6, 1848, the crisis broke open. A crowd in Vienna intercepted a regiment attempting to leave for Hungary. In the scuffle, the Minister of War, Count Latour, was seized by the mob and lynched, hung from a lamppost. The reaction from the palace was immediate and merciless. Field Marshal Windischgrätz, fresh from his victory in Prague, was ordered to march on Vienna. Within weeks, imperial forces surrounded the city. Barricades went up. The academic legion mobilized. For the second time in a year, Vienna was under siege, but now from its own army. On October 31, after days of artillery bombardment, the city fell. Thousands were killed or wounded. Leaders of the revolution were arrested or executed. The Reichstag was moved to Kremsier in Moravia under tight supervision. The revolution, in Vienna at least, was over. But something deeper had changed. The empire had survived the year, but only barely. The monarchy had crushed rebellion with iron, but at the cost of trust, unity, and legitimacy. And in the Hofburg Palace, young Archduke Franz Joseph was now being prepared to take the crown. Could a new emperor, unburdened by Metternich's legacy but shaped by its collapse, restore what had been lost? Or was the Habsburg Empire already past the point of repair? The fires in Vienna had barely cooled by the end of October 1848, but the symbolism was clear. The Habsburgs had retaken their capital not by negotiation, but by cannon. The revolutionary spring had ended in smoke and silence. And into this silence, a new figure stepped forward: Franz Joseph, just 18 years old. On December 2, 1848, under pressure from the court and military elites, Emperor Ferdinand I abdicated. His nephew, Franz Joseph, was declared Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, and ruler of the Habsburg dominions. He had not sought the throne, but the throne had sought him. The young emperor. Franz Joseph was not a revolutionary, nor a reactionary in the old mold. He was a product of rigorous Habsburg tradition, military discipline, religious devotion, and imperial absolutism. But unlike Metternich, he represented not the old guard but a renewed conservatism, one that sought control not through negotiation but through centralization and strength. From his first moments as emperor, he signaled a change. He refused to recognize the constitutional reforms of the Reichstag at Kremsier. He would not be a constitutional monarch. The crown, he believed, came from God, not from assemblies. His advisors, many of them survivors of the revolutionary chaos, agreed. Austria, they concluded, must be recentralized, and quickly. But how does one rebuild an empire when nearly every corner is either in open revolt or suspicious silence? The empire reasserts itself. The year 1849 became the year of reconquest. In Hungary, the autonomous government under Lajos Kossuth had declared full independence from Habsburg rule. A Hungarian army had been raised, and for a time it seemed successful. But Franz Joseph refused to compromise. The empire mobilized its army and, crucially, turned to Russia for help. In August 1849, after a brutal campaign, 200,000 Russian troops entered Hungary. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Hungarian resistance collapsed. Kossuth fled into exile. Thousands were imprisoned. 13 Hungarian generals were executed by firing squad in Ohrid, an event mourned as the Martyrs of Ohrid. The message was unmistakable. The Habsburg monarchy would not tolerate federalism or separatism. Hungary would be ruled, not negotiated with. In Italy, the Habsburgs regained control of Lombardy Venetia after a series of military victories. The liberal revolts in Milan and Venice were crushed. Venice, which had proclaimed a republic under Daniel Manin, endured a long siege before surrendering in August 1849. Manin, like so many others, went into exile. In Bohemia, Czech nationalist hopes were subdued after the failed Slavic Congress. Military occupation silenced dissent. The promise of cultural autonomy faded. German remained the language of administration. The Slavic peoples were once again deemed subjects, not partners. Everywhere the imperial flag was raised anew, and beneath it, military rule, press restrictions, and centralized authority returned with a vengeance. The constitution that wasn't. Throughout this period, Austrian officials engaged in a delicate rhetorical game. They spoke of reform, of modernization, even of constitutionalism, but it was always under imperial control. In March 1849, the so-called March Constitution was proclaimed without debate, without assembly. It confirmed the emperor's supreme power, offered limited rights, and emphasized unity over federalism. But it was a hollow document. By 1851, the Constitution was formally revoked, replaced by the Sylvester Patent, a decree reasserting full absolutism. The brief revolutionary experiment with parliamentary rule had ended. Censorship returned. The press was gagged. Student organizations were disbanded. The academic legion, once symbols of liberal hope, was dismantled. Surveillance expanded again. The ghosts of Metternich's system were reborn not in the man, but in the machine he left behind. Franz Joseph had not restored the ancient regime. He had rebuilt a sleeker, more militarized version of it. What had changed? And yet something had changed. Despite the reassertion of imperial authority, the revolutions of 1848 left deep cracks in the empire's foundation. National consciousness had awakened. The Czechs, Hungarians, Croats, Italians, and others had begun to see themselves not just as subjects, but as peoples with rights, histories, and futures of their own. Even in defeat, the seeds of nationalism had taken root. The myth of stability was broken. The revolutions had revealed how brittle the empire truly was. It had been ruled through inertia and tradition, not consent. Once questioned, that rule had to be enforced with violence. The role of the emperor had shifted. Franz Joseph's reign began not with pomp, but with crisis. He became a wartime monarch, trained not to build consensus but to suppress discontent. His worldview, shaped by revolution, would guide him for the next 68 years, a reign marked by rigidity and recurring unrest. The long shadow of 1848. The irony of Metternich's fall is this: though he was forced into exile, the system he built outlived him. His tools, espionage, censorship, suppression, were taken up again, but without his personal political finesse, they became blunt instruments. Franz Joseph ruled with order, but it was an order without affection, a stability without inspiration. The empire survived, but it did not heal. By the 1860s, nationalist movements would rise again. By 1867, the empire would be forced to transform into the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy, conceding major autonomy to Hungary to keep the empire together. And in 1914, the assassination of Franz Joseph's heir would trigger the First World War, the final unraveling of everything Metternich, and later Franz Joseph, had fought to preserve. Final reflection. The fall of Metternich was not the end of reaction in Europe. It was the beginning of its transformation. From personal control to bureaucratic authoritarianism, from conservative paternalism to militarized empire. 1848 did not topple the Habsburgs, but it shattered their certainty. The old man who once claimed to be the coachman of Europe had stepped down, but the coach he left behind kept running driverless, rattling down the path of history toward an uncertain destination. What does it mean when a revolution fails to win, but still succeeds in making the old world impossible to restore? Story 3: Workers and Windmills, the Paris June Days Uprising. In the spring of 1848, the boulevards of Paris bloomed with promise. Not just the chestnut trees lining the streets, but the political blossoms of a new republic, the Second French Republic, declared on February 24, in the wake of King Louis Philippe's abdication. For the first time since the fall of Napoleon, universal male suffrage had been granted. The monarchy was gone. The tricolor flag once again flew not for a king, but for the people. The barricades had triumphed. But history, as it so often does, proved more complicated than slogans. And for the workers of Paris, those who had bled for the revolution, the victory would soon feel hollow. The June Days Uprising, a short-lived but bloody conflict, would not be a fight between monarchists and republicans, nor between army and invader. It would be a civil war within the revolution, a reckoning between two incompatible visions of the republic, one social, the other liberal. To understand how that came to pass, we must begin not in battle but in policy. The birth of the national workshops. In the weeks following the February Revolution, a wave of euphoria swept the capital. The provisional government, composed of moderate Republicans and a few committed socialists like Louis Blanc, promised to address the social question, that is, the chronic poverty and unemployment of France's urban workers. Under pressure from workers' clubs and delegates from the barricades, the government created the National Workshops, a program intended to provide employment to thousands of jobless laborers. Modeled loosely on utopian socialist ideas, the workshops were meant to be a dignified alternative to charity or poorhouses. Each man enrolled received a small daily wage in exchange for labor digging ditches, clearing roads, or more often than not, waiting for assignments that never came. By April, the national workshops had become overwhelmed. What began with a few thousand workers ballooned to over 100,000, as desperate men from the provinces flooded Paris in search of work. Critics, especially conservative landowners and bourgeois politicians, viewed the workshops as a drain on the treasury and a breeding ground for radicalism. Pamphlets began referring to the workers as idlers and parasites. Newspapers printed cartoons of shaggy bearded men sleeping in ditches with shovels at their sides. But to the workers, the workshops were the only visible proof that the Republic cared for them. They were, in effect, the revolution's last promise. And that promise would soon be broken. The tensions in the Republic. The National Assembly, elected in April 1848, revealed the deep ideological divide in the country. While Paris voted overwhelmingly for radical and socialist candidates, the countryside, which held the majority, voted for conservative Republicans, many of whom feared disorder far more than inequality. This assembly was led by figures like Alexandre Ledru-Rollin and Alphonse de Lamartine, men of principle, but also of pragmatism. They viewed the revolution not as a blank slate, but as a chance to re-establish order on new terms. To many of them, the national workshops had outlived their usefulness. In June, the Assembly voted to close the workshops. The workers would be given a choice: join the army or accept rural agricultural labor in the provinces. It was not a negotiation, it was an ultimatum. When news of the decree spread through the workers' districts of eastern Paris, the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the Faubourg du Temple, and others, there was no protest march, no formal petition. There was, instead, a quiet, seething fury. The men who had defended the revolution, who had marched with red flags and tricolor cockades, now felt betrayed by the very government they had helped install. The barricades rise again. On June 23, 1848, the eastern quarters erupted. Unlike the spontaneous February revolution, the June days were a calculated insurrection. The workers built hundreds of barricades, larger, stronger, and more strategically placed than ever before. They commandeered carriages, felled trees, and tore up cobblestones, transforming the narrow streets of the right bank into a fortified labyrinth. Windmills on the hilltops were used to signal enemy movements. Church bells rang out across the arrondissements. This was not simply a riot. It was an uprising against the Republic itself, or at least the version of the Republic that had chosen property over people. One banner captured the essence of the rebellion: liberty or death. The Republic must be social or it is nothing. The government, stunned by the scale of the resistance, responded with overwhelming force. General Louis-Eugène Cavaignac, a hard-nosed officer from Algeria, was given emergency powers to suppress the revolt. Thousands of regular troops, National Guardsmen, and mobile guards were mobilized. Artillery was brought into the capital. Cavaignac had no interest in negotiation. What followed was 3 days of street warfare, a brutal, claustrophobic fight waged inch by inch. Artillery pounded barricades. Snipers fired from windows. Soldiers kicked down doors in pursuit of rebels. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Estimates vary, but between 3,000 to 5,000 workers were killed. Thousands more were wounded. Over 10,000 were arrested, many of them deported to colonies like Algeria without trial. By June 26, the uprising was crushed. Paris fell silent again. The aftermath. The June days marked a turning point in the history of the Second Republic, and in the broader arc of 1848. The rift between labor and liberalism had been laid bare. The bourgeois Republicans, once sympathetic to social demands, had turned decisively toward order. The dream of a social republic was buried under the rubble of barricades. General Cavaignac, hailed by many as the savior of the republic, became its de facto leader, a military man in charge of a democratic state, an irony not lost on foreign observers. The national workshops were not just abolished, they were erased from memory, treated as a failed experiment rather than a broken promise. For the working class of Paris, the lesson was bitter. The Republic may speak in your name, but it does not necessarily serve your needs. A final reflection. The June days were not as famous as the Bastille. They were not romanticized in songs or paintings. No novels gave them the heroic glow of revolution. Yet they were perhaps the most important confrontation of 1848, a confrontation not over kings, but over class. The barricades had risen not to restore a monarch or claim a throne, but to assert a right to dignity, to demand that liberty include bread as well as ballots. They were met not with compromise, but with cannon fire. And the republic born in idealism emerged more suspicious, more authoritarian, and more deeply divided than before. What happens when those who fight for a revolution are the first to be excluded from its rewards? The sun rose slowly over Paris on June 24, 1848, casting a pale yellow light on the eastern quartier still veiled in smoke. The echoes of artillery had not ceased. The June days were now in full eruption, a war inside the Republic, and no one could deny it anymore. The barricades that had gone up in the working-class faubourgs had multiplied. Some were simple stacks of paving stones. Others were engineering marvels, massive constructions reinforced with iron and bristling with scavenged weapons. What made this uprising unique was not only the scale, but its clarity. These were not monarchists or Bonapartists. They were the very workers who had hailed the Republic just 4 months before. The government's betrayal of the national workshops, which had promised labor and dignity, was the match. Now, the fire was spreading. A city split in two. Paris had seen barricades before, but this was different. In February, the barricades had drawn sympathy from bourgeois liberals and even members of the National Guard. This time, they drew fear. The insurgents now faced not just police or royal troops, but Republican soldiers, many of them fellow citizens, armed and disciplined under General Louis-Eugène Cavaignac. Trained in the conquest of Algeria, Cavaignac brought colonial methods to the streets of Paris: siege tactics, artillery bombardments, and door-to-door purges. One contemporary observer noted, "The soldiers advanced not like liberators, but like an occupying force. They looked upon Paris as if it were Algiers." And so it was. The government had effectively declared war on its own city. The front lines were not drawn between armies but between classes, between the rich western arrondissements and the impoverished eastern faubourgs. The Seine became a psychological as much as geographic divide. The people in revolt. To understand the uprising, one must look not to the politicians, but to the workers themselves, those men and women whose names history rarely records. Many had walked daily to the offices of the national workshops, only to wait for hours, earning 2 francs for meaningless labor. Some had come from the provinces, expecting a better life, only to find tenements filled with rats and disease. Among the insurgents were stonemasons, weavers, printers, and unemployed journeymen. They were organized through workers' clubs themselves, a product of the February Revolution's brief experiment with free association. The language of the barricades was passionate but articulate. Slogans painted on walls included La République démocratique et sociale, the democratic and social republic. Pain ou la mort, bread or death. Les droits du peuple ne se discutent pas. The rights of the people are not up for debate. They did not rise for kings or ideologies, but for recognition as citizens, as contributors, as humans. And yet to the ruling assembly, they were now insurgents, a threat to the Republic's survival. The Republican response. General Cavaignac acted swiftly and mercilessly. On June 24, he cut off the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, a historic center of rebellion since the 1789 revolution, using artillery to clear the Rue du Faubourg. Barricade after barricade was smashed under cannon fire. Snipers were dragged from attics. Entire buildings collapsed. By June 25, the army had encircled the Temple and St. Martin districts, where resistance remained fiercest. Orders were given to advance street by street. National Guard battalions once aligned with the workers split. Some defected to the rebels, others fought for Cavaignac. Brother faced brother. The fighting was so intense in some quarters that entire blocks were left uninhabitable, and thousands of civilians were displaced. The bells of Paris, which had once rung for liberty, now told warnings of incoming troops. The silence after. By June 26, the revolt had been broken. Most barricades had fallen. The last holdouts, including a few radical clubs, were either captured or fled. In total, 3,000 workers were killed. Over 10,000 were wounded or imprisoned. Thousands were deported without trial to Algeria or French Guiana, what the state now called colonial resettlement. The army suffered casualties as well, though far fewer, but the moral cost to the Republic was immeasurable. Cavaignac was hailed in the Assembly as the savior of the Republic. He received emergency executive power, effectively becoming dictator in all but name. He walked the corridors of the Hôtel de Ville with calm precision, issuing orders while the streets still reeked of gunpowder. Yet others saw in him the embodiment of betrayal, the general who crushed the very people whose revolution had birthed the Republic. A shattered dream of solidarity. After the June days, the Republic entered a period of deep political cynicism. The workers, who had believed in universal brotherhood, now saw that universal suffrage did not mean universal justice. Trust between workers and bourgeoisie, already strained, collapsed entirely. Liberal Republicans, frightened by the violence, turned toward law and order, increasingly allying with conservatives and military men. Socialists were marginalized, accused of sedition, and excluded from positions of power. The red flag, the symbol of the workers, was now banned. Even singing La Marseillaise could be punished. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church regained influence, especially among rural voters. Property owners demanded more policing. The tone of the Republic changed from one of possibility to one of preservation. In December 1848, Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the former emperor, was elected president in a landslide. His campaign had promised order, religion, and prosperity, a far cry from the ideals of February. And so, just 6 months after the barricades of June were cleared, the Republic stood intact in name, but transformed in character. The unanswered question. The June days raised a question that would echo through the coming century, not just in France, but across industrializing Europe. Can a republic serve both liberty and equality? The workers of Paris believed they were fighting not against the Republic, but for its fulfillment, a republic with bread, with dignity, with meaningful labor. But to the Republic's leaders, those demands became too radical, too destabilizing. Thus, the paradox of 1848, a revolution that gave universal suffrage but suppressed those who used it to demand economic justice. And though the revolt was crushed, the question it raised lingered, in whispers and songs, in factory meetings and socialist newspapers, in exiles' letters and prison memoirs. A republic had been defended. But whose republic had it become? The cannons had fallen silent. The smoke cleared from the narrow lanes of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. The barricades were gone, smashed into rubble, carted off by soldiers and scavengers. Paris returned to its routine, or at least it pretended to. But the wounds of the June Days uprising were not just physical. They were ideological, emotional, and unspoken. France would not forget what had happened, nor would it remember it honestly. The Republic survived, but in surviving, it became something fundamentally different than the workers had dreamed. The Republic without the people. In the wake of the uprising, General Cavaignac remained the dominant political figure. With dictatorial powers granted by the National Assembly, he oversaw a swift, bureaucratic restoration of order. Workers' associations were banned. Radical newspapers were shut down or censored. Known activists were placed under surveillance or arrested. And the national workshops, once the centerpiece of the social republic, were erased from policy discussions, mentioned only as a warning. The Second Republic was now, in all but name, a bourgeois republic. It upheld political rights but abandoned social ones. It favored civil order over economic justice. It became a republic that was democratic at the ballot box, but autocratic in policy. The fracture between labor and liberalism, so vividly exposed during the June Days, hardened into a permanent scar. Even as elections were held and constitutions debated, fear of the working class shaped every policy. June became a political shorthand for anarchy, danger, class war. In polite society, those who had manned the barricades were not heroes. They were fauteurs de trouble, troublemakers. A month later, in July 1848, a new monument was proposed, not for the fallen workers, but for those who defended the Republic against them. History was being curated carefully, from barricades to ballots. As 1848 drew to a close, the Republic entered a new phase. On December 10, 1848, France held its first presidential election by universal male suffrage. It was a radical democratic experiment, one man, one vote. Over 75% of the electorate participated. The result stunned the political class. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of Napoleon I, won with an overwhelming 74% of the vote. How had a man with no revolutionary credentials, no role in February or June become the face of France? The answer, in part, lies in the aftermath of the June Days. To the rural population, Bonaparte offered order, religion, and stability. To the bourgeoisie, he promised to defend property. To some of the working class, disillusioned by the betrayal of the Republic, he represented a return to strong leadership, perhaps even justice. It was a vote not for a man, but for security, memory, and amnesia. The Republic had been born in revolt. Now it would be governed by nostalgia. The forgotten dead. In the years that followed, the workers who died in June became the subject of uneasy silence. There were no official monuments for them, no national day of mourning, no military honors. But they were not forgotten. Victor Hugo, horrified by the repression, wrote in Les Miserables, "The barricade was terrible. It was not a barricade, it was a wall between two worlds." In the backrooms of socialist clubs, in letters smuggled from prison colonies, in whispered conversations between laborers on the job site, the memory lived on. The idea of the social republic did not die in the Rue du Temple. It became a myth, a wound, a cause for future generations. It would resurface in 1871 during the Paris Commune, and again in labor movements across Europe in the decades to follow. For some, the June Days became proof that a republic could not be trusted to deliver justice. For others, they became a martyrdom, a tragic prelude to the real revolution yet to come. Legacy in silence. The irony of the June Days is that they began with a dream of inclusion, that a republic might not just grant political rights, but ensure economic dignity. That dream was neither utopian nor unreasonable, but it was treated as dangerous. The events of June 1848 drew a line in French political thought that would remain for generations. Socialists looked back at June as a betrayal. Liberals saw it as a necessary defense of republican order. Conservative used it to warn against the perils of universal suffrage. In truth, it was a failure on all sides, a missed opportunity to build a broader consensus between classes, between visions of justice. The canons of Cavaignac did not just silence an uprising. They narrowed the definition of the republic. They made it safer for capital, for property, for control, but not necessarily for those who needed it most. Final reflection. The June days lasted 4 days, but their legacy lasted decades. They showed how fragile democratic promises can be when confronted with the realities of poverty and inequality. They showed that revolutions are not simply events, they are tests. Tests of whether ideals can survive when food is scarce, when fear runs high, when different visions of society clash in the same street. And they left behind a single, haunting question that still resonates. Can liberty exist without equality? Can a republic endure if it fears the very people it claims to represent? Story 4. The Frankfurt Parliament, Democracy on Draft Paper. In May of 1848, a curious experiment began inside a church. Not a revolution, though revolution had made it possible. Not a war, though armies and borders hovered in every mind. No, this was a parliament. A German parliament, seated in the Paulskirche, St. Paul's Church, in the city of Frankfurt am Main. There had never been such a thing before. For centuries, Germany had not been a country, but an idea, a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and free cities, bound loosely by language and law, and even more loosely by the Holy Roman Empire, which had dissolved in 1806. The Napoleonic Wars had reorganized this fragmented world into the German Confederation, a diplomatic framework with no real teeth, dominated by Austria and Prussia. But now, in the spring of 1848, that was changing. In the wake of revolutions erupting across Europe from Palermo to Paris to Vienna, Germans were dreaming of unity, of constitutions, and of a common national identity. The Frankfurt Parliament, also called the Frankfurt National Assembly, was born of this hope. It was the first freely elected body to claim representation over all of Germany. It was the first time that lawyers, professors, writers, clergymen, and a few landowners sat in one chamber to debate the shape of a unified German state. And yet, for all its promise, the parliament would end in failure, not from lack of vision, but from too much vision, too many dreams written in ink but not steel. This is the story of a constitution drafted in a church, and a revolution that drowned in paper. The path to the parliament. To understand how Germany reached this moment, we must return to the March revolutions of 1848. In dozens of German cities, Berlin, Munich, Dresden, Stuttgart, and others, demonstrations had broken out demanding constitutions, freedom of the press, and national unification. The middle classes, often derided as boring by later history, were in fact the heart of this upheaval. Lawyers, schoolteachers, minor bureaucrats, and merchants who had grown weary of censorship, fragmented governance, and stagnant opportunities. The rulers, caught off guard, granted concessions. In Prussia, King Friedrich Wilhelm IV promised a constitution and even wore the German tricolor. In Austria, Metternich fled Vienna, and Emperor Ferdinand granted reforms temporarily. In the smaller German states, princes bowed to the crowds, if only for a time. With this unexpected opening, the idea of a national assembly moved rapidly from fantasy to fact. In March, delegates from across the Confederation met in Heidelberg and proposed a pre-parliament, a gathering to organize elections for a larger, representative body. That body, the Frankfurt Parliament, was convened in May 1848 in the Free City of Frankfurt, one of the few places not directly under monarchic authority. Its meeting place, the Paulskirche, had been a Protestant church. Now it was the stage for a secular national drama. Who were they? The Frankfurt delegates were not revolutionaries in the street-fighting sense. They were idealists, constitutionalists, and above all, intellectuals. Out of over 500 members, the vast majority were lawyers or professors. Some joked it was the largest faculty meeting in history. Middle-aged middle-class male, educated in Enlightenment thought and the romanticism of national unity. Some were radicals, others conservatives. Many were moderate liberals hoping to forge a balance between monarchy and democracy. The assembly was unprecedented, but also unprepared. There were no parties, no agreed-upon leadership structure. Delegates came with competing visions. Should Germany be a federation or a centralized state? Should Austria be included in the new Germany or excluded, given its vast non-German territories? Should the new Germany be a monarchy or a republic? The first task, write a constitution, but the question was for whom? The Austrian question. Austria was the elephant in the Paulskirche. The Austrian Empire ruled over millions of German speakers, but also Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, Croats, Italians, and more. Including Austria in a unified Germany meant absorbing a multinational empire, which many feared would make the new nation unwieldy or impossible to define. On the other hand, excluding Austria meant sidelining the largest German-speaking power. Thus two camps formed. The Großdeutschland, Greater Germany faction, which wanted a Germany with Austria. The Kleindeutschland, Lesser Germany faction, which preferred a Germany without Austria led by Prussia. At first, the parliament tried to hedge, but Austria's internal revolutions and its subsequent reassertion of imperial control made it clear that Vienna would not consent to any arrangement that weakened its sovereignty. By late 1848, the parliament began shifting toward the Prussian-led Kleindeutschland solution. And in doing so, they placed their hopes in King Friedrich Wilhelm IV, a monarch with constitutional misgivings, and a romantic idea of divine kingship. The drafting begins. Through the summer and autumn of 1848, the Parliament engaged in exhaustive debates on civil liberties, representation, press freedom, religious tolerance, and the separation of powers. They were earnest, detailed, idealistic, but also glacially slow. As one delegate wrote, "We are building a house in a storm, but we argue over the curtains." Outside the Paulskirche, real power remained with the princes and kings. The parliament had no army, no treasury, and no executive authority. It existed only by the goodwill of monarchs, a commodity in short supply. While the delegates drafted rights, rulers rearmed. As revolution began to fade across Europe, the kings who had once been on the defensive regained confidence. In Vienna, the emperor crushed the Hungarian and Czech revolts. In Berlin, the king dissolved the Prussian Constituent Assembly. The counter-revolution was rising. Inside the church, the parliament still debated clauses. Outside, the window of possibility was closing. A dream takes form. Yet despite the odds, the parliament did complete its task. On March 28, 1849, after nearly a year of deliberation, the Frankfurt Assembly passed the Paulskirche Constitution, a document that included a constitutional monarchy, a Bill of Rights, a parliamentary system with two houses, universal male suffrage for the lower house. The new Germany would be unified, modern, and liberal. It would be led by a hereditary emperor, constrained by law. There was only one missing piece, a king to wear the crown. On April 3, 1849, the parliament offered the imperial crown to King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia. It was their boldest and most desperate move. What they did not know was that the king had already made up his mind. An unanswered offer. When the Prussian king received the offer, he famously declined, saying, "I will not pick up a crown from the gutter." To him, a crown offered by an elected body, rather than divinely sanctioned monarchs, was a humiliation. The Parliament, in his eyes, had no legitimacy. He had promised reforms in March 1848, but that was March. By 1849, the revolutions were failing, and the kings were back in control. Without Prussia's support, the Parliament's dream was dead on arrival. A final reflection. The Frankfurt Parliament was not crushed by violence, like the Paris June days or the Hungarian revolt. It was crushed by indifference, by the unwillingness of kings to cede power and the inability of intellectuals to wield it. It was a revolution made with pen and paper, not rifles, and while its constitution was visionary, it had no means to enforce itself. Still, for the first time in German history, a national liberal dream had been articulated. It would take another 20 years and a war for Germany to be unified. But when it was, it bore little resemblance to the Paulskirch's vision. What happens when a nation writes its future, only to find no one willing to read it? It was the spring of 1849, and the Parliament seated in Frankfurt's Paulskirch had, at last, completed its monumental task. After nearly a year of deliberation, dispute, and drafting, the representatives of the German people had produced a constitution, one they believed could unify the fractured German states under a modern, liberal framework. But what is a constitution without a sovereign? What is a government without force? The moment the Parliament offered the imperial crown to King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia, everything turned. And yet, it is important to understand that the king's refusal was not just a snub. It was a profound reassertion of monarchical legitimacy over democratic aspiration. The king was not merely rejecting a piece of jewelry. He was rejecting an entire idea, that sovereignty could flow from the people rather than God. Let us return to that fateful moment and explore what followed. The king's refusal. The offer was made formally on April 3, 1849. A delegation from the Frankfurt Parliament, dressed in sober dark coats and high hopes, arrived at the royal palace in Berlin. They came bearing the crown of a united Germany not forged in war, but in words. Friedrich Wilhelm IV received them politely, and then, just as politely, declined. His reasoning was complex, but not obscure. He refused to accept a crown from a revolutionary body, which he considered illegitimate. He feared that accepting the crown would mean war with Austria, which still opposed any union that excluded it. He also mistrusted the Prussian liberals who supported the Frankfurt Assembly, and had already made clear his distaste for parliamentary sovereignty. In private, he is said to have remarked that he would not take a crown from the gutter. To the delegates this was a betrayal, but to the king it was defense of tradition. And so the keystone was removed from the arch. Collapse from within. After the king's refusal, the momentum behind the Parliament collapsed rapidly. Delegates began to withdraw. Some states revoked their support for the Constitution. Others simply ignored it. In May 1849, a number of smaller states, especially in the South and West, attempted to implement the Constitution anyway, declaring it binding within their territories. They were joined by student groups, workers' clubs, and liberal nationalists who still hoped to salvage something from the failed project. But without military backing, these actions were symbolic and dangerous. Insurrections erupted in Baden, Württemberg, the Palatinate region of Bavaria, parts of Saxony. These uprisings were spontaneous, poorly coordinated, and often naive. They declared their allegiance to the Paulskirch Constitution and attempted to raise local militias to defend it. But the response was swift. Repression by fire. King Friedrich Wilhelm IV, having rejected the imperial crown, now sent his army to crush the very constitution he had refused to accept. The irony was bitter. Prussia would defend German order, not German unity. Prussian troops, supported in some cases by Austrian forces, moved in to restore monarchical authority. One by one, the revolutionary strongholds fell. In Dresden, street fighting lasted 5 days before the uprising was crushed. Among the revolutionaries was a young composer named Richard Wagner, who would later flee into exile. In Baden, the liberal army was led by Friedrich Hecker and Gustav Struve, two prominent radicals. Their forces were defeated at the Battle of Waghäusel in June. The final blow came in July 1849, when the last remnants of the resistance were defeated at Rastatt Fortress. Thousands were arrested. Hundreds were executed. Many more fled to Switzerland, France, England, or across the Atlantic to the United States, where a generation of German liberals known as the 48ers would contribute to American political and cultural life. Meanwhile, in Frankfurt, the once crowded Paulskirche stood nearly empty. The Parliament was formally dissolved on May 31, 1849. What had begun with cheering crowds and high hope ended with silence. Exile in memory. The failure of the Frankfurt Parliament marked the end of the liberal nationalist phase of the 1848 revolutions in Germany, but it was not the end of its legacy. In the short term, the consequences were grim. Monarchies reasserted dominance. Censorship returned. Constitutions were revoked or rewritten to limit power. Surveillance expanded. But something had changed. The idea of a German nation, not merely as a cultural concept, but as a political project, had taken hold. Even conservative rulers could not fully ignore it. The next time unification came, it would be on very different terms, but its roots lay here in the debates and disappointments of 1848-49. And for the liberals who survived, exile was not just a physical departure. It was a mental adjustment. Many concluded that words alone, paper, speeches, votes were not enough. The next revolution, if there would be one, would need power behind it. Reflections in the ruins. What doomed the Frankfurt Parliament? Historians have pointed to many causes. The absence of military power. The lack of unity among German states. The delay in finalizing a constitution. The refusal to confront the monarchs until it was too late. But perhaps its greatest flaw was idealism without leverage. The delegates had believed that if they simply built a rational, just framework, the world would follow, that rulers would recognize wisdom, that people would prefer law to custom. But power does not yield to paper, and unity cannot be written into being. The quiet legacy. Though the Frankfurt Parliament failed, its constitution was not forgotten. In the decades that followed, German liberals would continue to reference the Paulskirche model as a noble attempt to unite liberty and nationhood. When Germany was finally unified in 1871, it would be done not by liberals, but by Otto von Bismarck, a Prussian conservative who mocked the parliament as naive. The German empire he built had a parliament, yes, but it served under an emperor, with real power held by the military and the chancellor. Still, the Paulskirche remained a symbol, a memory of what might have been. A church transformed into a parliament. A crown offered but refused. A nation imagined but not yet born. What if they had acted sooner? What if the pen had moved as quickly as the sword? As the summer of 1849 faded, so too did the final flickers of the Frankfurt Parliament. By the end of May, the remaining members clinging to legitimacy relocated from Frankfurt to Stuttgart in the Kingdom of Württemberg. They called themselves the Rump Parliament, a name that already carried the bitter taste of defeat. They arrived with no real support, no army, no treasury, and no mandate beyond their own convictions. On June 18, 1849, Wurtemberg troops entered the chamber and forcibly dispersed the assembly. No bloodshed, no final speeches, just a quiet eviction. Thus ended the first all-German parliament. But the echoes would carry far beyond that summer. The Rump Parliament and the road to nowhere. The Rump was composed of the most radical members who refused to accept the collapse of the Frankfurt Project. Their goal was no longer compromise with monarchs, but open confrontation. Some even advocated establishing a German republic, replacing the constitutional monarchy outlined in the Paulskirch Constitution. But reality was cruel. The broader population was exhausted by a year of failed revolts, broken promises, and economic instability. The rural majority remained conservative or apathetic. Monarchs reasserted themselves with terrifying speed and confidence. No states recognized the authority of the Rump Parliament, and when soldiers arrived to shut it down, no one resisted. The revolution had not just failed, it had evaporated. The fates of the delegates. Of the 585 men who had once filled the pews of the Paulskirch, only a handful would continue in political life. Some, like Robert Blum, had already been executed during the Vienna Uprising of 1848. Others, like Johann Jacobi, retreated into quiet opposition and exile. A significant number, perhaps 30 to 40%, emigrated, especially to the United States, becoming part of the 48ers. These German liberals brought with them their ideas, their experience, and their disillusionment, influencing American politics, journalism, and education. One of the most famous exiles was Carl Schurz, who later became a Union general in the American Civil War and served as a U.S. Senator and Secretary of the Interior. For those who stayed in Germany, the coming years would be ones of reaction, not progress. The Restoration begins. From 1850 onward, the German Confederation was re-established under the leadership of Austria, its old master. The revolutionary symbols of 1848 flags, constitutions, assemblies were either banned or neutered. Censorship returned. Secret police expanded. Universities were purged of subversive professors. Workers' associations were shut down. In Prussia, King Friedrich Wilhelm IV abandoned even the moderate reforms he had offered in March 1848. His constitution, imposed in 1850, was designed to preserve monarchical authority while offering the facade of participation through a three-class voting system that favored the wealthy. The mood across the German states was one of discipline, fear, and repression. The liberal generation that had filled the Paulskirch found itself silenced or sidelined. But memory is not so easily erased. The seed beneath the soil. For all its failures, the Frankfurt Parliament had planted something deeper, an idea of Germany as a nation, defined not by dynastic boundaries or imperial convenience, but by shared language, common rights, and constitutional law. Even conservatives could no longer deny that some form of unification was inevitable. The question was no longer if, but how. When that unification came in 1871, it looked nothing like what the delegates of 1848 had imagined. It came not from a church, but from a battlefield. Not by liberal consensus, but by military conquest and diplomatic cunning, orchestrated by Otto von Bismarck. The German Empire, proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, was built by Prussia, not Frankfurt. It was dominated by the military, not by parliamentarians. And though it bore the name Empire, it bore little resemblance to the ideals of 1848. Still, many of the legal and civic principles championed at the Paulskirch would eventually return. The idea of civil rights. The dream of German federalism. The model of a bicameral parliament. The Frankfurt Constitution was not implemented, but it was remembered. A constitutional ghost. Today, St. Paul's Church in Frankfurt is a museum, a monument. It still stands quiet, dignified, with plaques and displays commemorating the delegates who once filled its pews. To walk through, it is to step into the ghost of a constitution, a place where Germany's first attempt at democracy was born and buried. It is peaceful now, even calming, but in 1848 it was the heart of a nervous experiment in sovereignty. In that year, the question of who speaks for Germany was asked for the first time. The answer never came. Final reflection. The Frankfurt Parliament failed, but its failure was not simple. It did not collapse from internal chaos alone, nor from some flaw in liberalism. It fell because it had no army, no unified public support, and no monarch willing to be bound. It fell because the old world was not yet ready to relinquish power, and the new world was not yet strong enough to demand it. But even in failure, the Parliament accomplished something rare. It defined the German question. It drafted what might have been. And it proved that the idea of a democratic, unified Germany was not a fantasy, it was simply premature. In history, some revolutions build nations. Others write the plans that later builders use. And sometimes, a church full of lawyers can imagine a country that soldiers will one day create. What if the pen had been followed by the sword, rather than crushed beneath it? What if democracy had taken hold not in defeat, but in power? Story 5: Louis Napoleon's Rise, the Elected Emperor. In the grand theater of European politics, few figures entered the stage as improbably and ascended as dramatically as Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. He was not a revolutionary leader. He did not command a barricade, pen a constitution, or lead a people's march. When the revolutions of 1848 erupted across Europe, Louis Napoleon was in exile, a largely forgotten pretender with a famous name and a string of failed coups behind him. And yet, by the end of 1848, he would be president of the French Republic, elected by an overwhelming majority in the first direct presidential election in French history. Just 4 years later, he would dissolve the Republic and proclaim himself Emperor Napoleon III. The rise of Louis Napoleon is not just a tale of political cunning. It is a cautionary episode in the dangers of nostalgia, the hunger for order after upheaval, and the strange power of a name. A strange political heir. Louis Napoleon was born in 1808, the son of Louis Bonaparte, one of Napoleon I's brothers, and Hortense de Beauharnais, the daughter of Empress Josephine. His lineage was impeccable for Bonapartists. But by the time of his adolescence, the Napoleonic Empire had fallen. Napoleon I was in exile, and so was much of the Bonaparte family. Louis Napoleon spent his youth in Switzerland, Italy, and England, studying history, artillery, and political theory. He also developed a curious mixture of beliefs, a blend of authoritarian centralism, social reformism, and romantic nationalism, often shaped more by fantasy than by realpolitik. Twice he attempted to seize power in France. In 1836, he led a ridiculous coup attempt in Strasbourg. In 1840, he tried again, this time landing at Boulogne with a small group of men and a golden eagle. Both failed spectacularly. He was arrested, tried, and imprisoned in the fortress of Ham, where he passed the time writing essays about Napoleonism, workers' welfare, and national unity. In 1846, he escaped in disguise, fleeing to England. By 1848, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was a political curiosity, neither a threat nor a statesman, just a man with a name. And then February happened. The opening appears. The fall of King Louis-Philippe in February 1848 created a power vacuum. The Second Republic was proclaimed. Universal male suffrage was granted. The government promised freedom of the press, workers' rights, and representation. But France was fractured. The Republic was beloved in Paris, but the rural provinces were wary. Conservatives feared socialism. Liberals feared disorder. And the working class, especially after the crushing of the June Days uprising, felt increasingly betrayed. Into this mix, Louis Napoleon entered quietly. He returned to France in September 1848 after securing a seat in the National Assembly by running in multiple departments and winning in most. His platform was vague. His speeches were minimal, but his name carried immense weight. For many older French citizens, Bonaparte meant stability, national pride, and strong leadership, a sharp contrast to the fragile, divided republic that had emerged from revolution. When elections were scheduled for president of the Republic, Louis Napoleon declared his candidacy. He had never governed anything. He had no party. His policies were opaque. But his name was on every monument in France. His uncle's legend still loomed, and most importantly, he promised order, respect for religion and property, support for the common man. The rural electorate, alienated by Parisian radicalism and unnerved by the June Days, listened. The election of December 1848. The election was held on December 10, 1848. It was the first time in French history that all adult men could vote directly for the head of state. Turnout was extraordinary. Over 7 million ballots were cast. The results stunned the political elite. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, 5.4 million votes. General Cavaignac, the suppressor of the June Days, 1.4 million votes. All other candidates, less than 500,000 votes combined. It was a landslide, but not one built on ideology. It was built on symbolism and longing. Rural voters remembered the stability of the Napoleonic era, regardless of the wars. Middle-class voters believed Louis Napoleon would protect property and avoid socialist policies. Even some workers believed he might deliver the social reforms his uncle never had. In truth, no one knew what Louis Napoleon really believed, and that was part of the appeal. The president who waited. Louis Napoleon took office in December 1848. His first move was to appear harmless. He surrounded himself with moderate ministers. He avoided confrontation with the assembly. He made public appearances in military uniform but rarely spoke. He played the role of the quiet, paternal figure, biding his time. Behind the scenes, he began to build power. He cultivated alliances with conservatives, especially monarchists who saw him as a temporary compromise. He cultivated the army, which still revered his uncle and detested the instability of parliamentary government. He built a personal bureaucracy, loyal to him, not the assembly. The assembly, meanwhile, remained deeply divided. It passed conservative laws, including a rollback of universal suffrage in 1850, which disenfranchised millions of working-class voters. The Republican ideal was already shrinking. All the while, Louis Napoleon remained vague, enigmatic, patient. He would not remain patient forever. A question begins to form. By 1851, the Republic was unpopular with almost everyone. Monarchists wanted a king. Workers felt excluded. Liberals feared rising authoritarianism. Conservatives feared disorder. Louis Napoleon's term was due to end in 1852, and the Constitution forbade re-election. The Assembly refused to amend it. So he began asking a quiet but powerful question. What if only one man could restore France's greatness? The Republic had given him power, but would it let him keep it? Would the people who had voted for him now follow him further beyond the limits of the Constitution? By the dawn of 1851, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer a political curiosity. He was the president of the French Republic, the most powerful elected man in Europe. And yet, behind the scenes, he had begun to act less like a president and more like a monarch in waiting. His ambitions, once carefully veiled behind vague statements and respectful silence, were becoming clearer. The constitutional order that had placed him in office was now an obstacle, and Louis Napoleon had no intention of stepping down. The Republic had given him legitimacy. Now he would use it to dismantle the Republic itself. The problem of 1852. The French Constitution of 1848 was explicit. The president would serve a single 4-year term and could not be re-elected. The authors of the Constitution, mindful of previous coups and Caesarist temptations, intended to keep executive power rotating, even at the cost of stability. But Louis Napoleon had no interest in being a transitional figure. He wanted to stay. And more than that, he wanted to transform the presidency into something more permanent, perhaps even imperial. Throughout 1850 and 1851, he attempted to persuade the National Assembly to amend the Constitution and allow his re-election. The proposal gained support in rural departments but met fierce resistance in the Assembly, especially from conservative Republicans and monarchists. When the motion failed to reach the required 2/3 majority, Louis Napoleon began preparing for a different solution. If the law stood in his way, he would remove the law. Cultivating power. During his presidency, Louis Napoleon had worked carefully and methodically to build a power base outside the Assembly. The army, the military, already disillusioned with parliamentary disorder, largely supported Louis Napoleon. He reinstated imperial uniforms, promoted Bonapartist generals, and encouraged a martial culture that harkened back to his uncle's days. The bureaucracy, prefects in the provinces were appointed for loyalty, not talent. Local officials were expected to report on public opinion and suppress Republican agitation. The press, though not officially censored, yet, newspapers that criticized the president were quietly harassed through fines, distribution delays, and denial of state advertising. The church, Louis Napoleon aligned with Catholic interests, repealing some secular education reforms and supporting the return of religious influence, particularly in rural areas. The masses, the common people, especially peasants and small landowners, saw in him a protector of order and religion. His image, always framed by Napoleon I's legacy, became a brand, printed on posters, coins, and cheap lithographs. He spoke rarely but posed often. His silence became part of his mystique. Preparing the coup. Throughout 1851, tensions rose. The Assembly attempted to curb presidential powers. Louis Napoleon responded by touring the provinces, giving subtle speeches about completing the revolution and restoring national greatness. Meanwhile, in secret, his inner circle, led by men like Persigny and Morny, his half-brother, drew up coup plans. The army was mobilized. Key Republican leaders were placed under surveillance. Loyal generals were positioned in Paris. Printing presses were secured. Telegraph lines were monitored. The chosen date, December 2, 1851. It was not accidental, it marked the anniversary of Napoleon I's coronation in 1804, the anniversary of the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. It was a symbolic nod to the imperial past, wrapped in military glory and legitimacy. The coup of December 2. In the early hours of December 2, the plan was executed with clockwork precision. Troops occupied the Assembly, the newspaper offices, and key ministries. Republican leaders were arrested in their beds, including Victor Hugo's close friend, Alexander Ledru-Rollin. Posters went up around Paris declaring the dissolution of the Assembly, the restoration of universal suffrage, and new elections. In a single morning, the Second Republic was effectively dissolved. There was some resistance in the streets. Barricades appeared briefly in working-class neighborhoods, but unlike 1848, the uprising was isolated and disorganized. The army moved decisively. Hundreds were killed. Thousands were arrested. Many were deported to Algeria, Guyana, or simply vanished into the penal system. Victor Hugo fled into exile, declaring, "The coup d'etat is a crime. France is dishonored." But most of France, especially in the rural provinces, responded with calm, some with approval, many with resignation. Louis Napoleon had promised order, and he had delivered it. A referendum of convenience. To lend legitimacy to the coup, Louis Napoleon called for a national plebiscite. The question was simple. Do you approve of the president's action to restore universal suffrage and reorganize the government? It was a yes or no vote. There were no opposition campaigns. Ballots were counted by state-appointed officials. The press was silent. On December 20, 1851, the results were announced. Yes, 7.5 million. No, 640,000. It was overwhelming, but it was not honest. Still, Louis Napoleon had what he needed, the appearance of popular consent. He was now a ruler without rivals, governing a republic in name only. The shadow of the empire. In the year following the coup, Louis Napoleon continued to consolidate power. The press was brought under tighter control. The legislature was reduced to a rubber-stamp body. A new constitution granted the president 10-year terms, with near-absolute power. But even that wasn't enough. By 1852, plans were underway to formally restore the empire. The trappings were already in place: uniforms, pageantry, and portraits reminiscent of Napoleon I. And on December 2, 1852, precisely 1 year after the coup, Louis Napoleon proclaimed himself Emperor Napoleon III, by the grace of God and the will of the nation. A republic had died not by invasion or revolution, but by election, referendum, and resignation. An open question. The rise of Napoleon III challenges our assumptions about democracy. He was elected, not imposed. He used legal mechanisms, elections, constitutional revisions, plebiscites to undermine those very institutions. He ruled in the name of the people, but not with their voice. His success revealed how vulnerable a republic can be when its institutions are weak, its leadership indecisive, and its population weary of instability. Can a democracy protect itself from those who promise to save it? By December 1852, a new empire had risen not from the battlefield, but from the ballot box. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, elected president of the Second Republic, had crowned himself Emperor Napoleon III, reviving the imperial title his uncle had forged through conquest nearly 50 years earlier. But this time there was no coronation at Notre Dame, no pope, no ceremony of swords and bishops. There was, instead, a speech to the Senate and a title ratified by yet another plebiscite. Yes to empire, 7.8 million votes. No, 250,000. Again, the results were overwhelming. Again, the process was carefully managed. And so, what began in 1848 as a republic built on revolution and universal suffrage ended as a monarchic regime disguised as popular will. This was the beginning of the Second French Empire, a regime defined by spectacle, bureaucracy, control, and a strange relationship with modernity. It would last for 18 years. But how did the emperor rule, and what legacy did his rise leave behind? A modern Caesar. Napoleon III styled himself not as a tyrant, but as a benevolent autocrat, a leader who governed by listening to the people, even if they had no real voice. His empire was structured with a senate and a legislative body, both largely powerless; a strong executive, controlling the army, civil service, and national policy; an extensive prefect system, ensuring loyalty in every province; a carefully curated press environment in which criticism was muted and praise amplified. But he was not merely a reactionary. In some ways, Napoleon III was surprisingly modern. He oversaw the reconstruction of Paris under Baron Haussmann, turning medieval streets into grand boulevards, partly to improve sanitation, partly to prevent future barricades. The expansion of the railways, connecting industrial centers to rural France. The growth of public banking and state-sponsored credit institutions. The legalization of limited trade unions and modest labor, reforms later in his reign. His goal was to appeal to all classes. To the working class, he promised dignity and progress. To the bourgeoisie, he offered profits and order. To conservatives and monarchists, he maintained Catholic tradition and imperial grandeur. All this without the mess of parliamentary politics. At least for a while. Beneath the veneer, the Second Empire was stable but not free. Political opposition was tolerated only in fragments. Republican leaders remained in exile or under surveillance. The press was censored, books required approval, plays and public lectures were monitored. Elections were held but under heavy state influence, with official candidates enjoying overwhelming advantages. The emperor toured the country regularly, dressed in military uniform, smiling in portraits. His image was plastered across coins, busts, and railway stations. It was a state built on perception. But perception is fragile. Growing doubts. By the late 1850s, cracks began to show. Economic discontent emerged as workers demanded more rights in rapidly industrializing cities. Strikes occurred, though often suppressed. Intellectual opposition grew among middle-class liberals, who resented censorship and the lack of true representation. Republicans and socialists, though scattered, re-emerged in underground newspapers and workers' clubs. International ambitions, especially in Italy and Mexico, began to overextend France's resources and provoke diplomatic tensions. Above all, the emperor began to lose the narrative. Once the man of destiny, he now appeared uncertain, ill, and unmoored. From empire to exile. In 1870, a crisis broke everything. Napoleon III, seeking to shore up prestige, entered into conflict with Prussia, led by Otto von Bismarck. The war that followed the Franco-Prussian War was a disaster. French forces were unprepared. Public support evaporated. The emperor himself was captured at the Battle of Sedan. Back in Paris, the empire collapsed within days. A new republic, the Third Republic, was declared on September 4, 1870. Napoleon III was exiled to England, where he died in quiet obscurity in 1873. Legacy of a paradox. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte's rise is one of the great contradictions of 19th century Europe. He was elected to lead a republic, then used that power to dismantle it. He invoked democracy, but ruled through centralized authority. He claimed to represent the common man, but often suppressed his voice. And yet, he was not a tyrant in the mold of Napoleon I, nor a reactionary like Metternich. He was something in between. A manager of perceptions, a technocrat in a uniform, a man who governed through illusion and incremental reform. His empire was not built to last, but it did redefine what political power looked like in the modern era. Propaganda, managed elections, surveillance, mass appeal rooted in nostalgia. All tools of the 20th century, perfected in the mid-19th. Final reflection. Louis Napoleon's rise is often dismissed as a fluke, a man who won power through name recognition and ruled by accident. But that underestimates the structures he built, the fears he exploited, and the hopes he co-opted. He showed how fragile democracy can be when faced with its own contradictions. Freedom and fear. Equality and control. Ballots and bayonets. the Second Republic did not fall to an external enemy, nor to popular uprising. It was voted out, replaced by familiarity, undone by longing. What happens when a nation mistakes authority for stability, when a memory becomes a mandate, when the people vote for power and find they cannot take it back? Story 6. Mazzini and the Roman Republic, a dream deferred. In the early days of 1849, as Europe trembled under the aftershocks of 1848's revolutionary tremors, a remarkable thing happened in Rome. For the first time in more than 1,000 years, the city of emperors and popes declared itself a republic. Gone was the temporal power of the pope. Gone were the noble intrigues of old Roman families. In their place stood Giuseppe Mazzini, idealist, exile, prophet of the Italian nation, invited to lead a newborn Roman republic that aspired not to dominate, but to uplift. It lasted barely 5 months. Yet in those months, the Roman Republic became a symbol of something larger. The tension between ideals and geopolitics, faith and freedom, Italy's past and its uncertain future. And it all began with the flight of a pope. The Pope in revolt. In 1846, the election of Pope Pius IX had stirred unusual optimism. Pius was young, comparatively liberal, and spoke of reforms. He freed political prisoners. He granted a civic guard. He hinted at modernizing the Papal States. Many Italians, especially moderates, began to hope that Pius might support the cause of Italian unification, or at least not stand in its way. But events quickly moved beyond even the Pope's control. By late 1848, revolts had shaken Sicily, Naples, and Milan. The Austrian hold on northern Italy was under siege. Rome itself was filled with political ferment. In November 1848, a flashpoint arrived: the assassination of Pellegrino Rossi, the Pope's chief minister, by a nationalist assassin. Fearing for his life, Pius IX fled the city disguised as a simple priest, escorted by Bavarian troops, and took refuge in the coastal fortress town of Gaeta. With the papal throne vacant and political authority evaporated, Roman radicals moved swiftly. A republic is declared. On February 9, 1849, after weeks of organizing and debates, the Roman Assembly formally proclaimed the Roman Republic. It was a bold declaration. The Pope has fallen, the temporal power of the clergy is abolished, the Roman Republic is founded. This was not a restoration of the ancient Roman Republic of antiquity, nor the brief French-backed Republic of 1798. This was something new, a vision of a secular, democratic, and unified Italy, with Rome as its heart. But a republic needs leaders. And so, the Assembly invited Giuseppe Mazzini, exiled philosopher of nationalism, to return to Rome and guide this delicate experiment. For Mazzini, it was a calling not to govern but to awaken. Mazzini returns to Rome. Mazzini had spent most of his adult life in exile in Switzerland, in London, writing impassioned appeals to the Italian people, founding secret societies, plotting failed uprisings. He had been ridiculed, hunted, excommunicated. But in Rome, he was greeted as a prophet. He arrived in March 1849, greeted by cheering crowds, torchlight processions, and high expectations. Alongside fellow leaders Carlo Armellini and Aurelio Saffi, Mazzini formed a triumvirate modeled, ironically, on the Roman past but aimed at building a future Italy. He spoke not of conquest or vengeance, but of education, liberty, and moral regeneration. The Republic, he insisted, would provide universal male suffrage, abolish the death penalty, guarantee freedom of religion and press, separate church and state, encourage public education, open politics to ordinary citizens. For a brief moment, the Republic buzzed with idealism. Teachers, artisans, former exiles, and priests joined together to build schools, distribute aid, and administer local government. Rome had not seen such civic participation in centuries. But shadows were lengthening. The world reacts. To conservatives across Europe, the Roman Republic was heresy in motion. The Pope's temporal power had been attacked by Italians, no less. Monarchs and clergy alike feared a dangerous precedent. If the Pope could be overthrown, what sacred institution was safe? In Austria, Bavaria, and Spain, leaders watched with hostility. But most decisive was France. The newly formed French Second Republic, under President Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte, was trying to win conservative support back home. And one way to do that was to restore the Pope, while also gaining influence in Italy. In April 1849, French troops landed in Civitavecchia, ostensibly to protect the Pope and defend Catholicism. They expected little resistance. Instead, they found a city ready to fight. Garibaldi enters the stage. To defend the Republic, Mazzini turned to another exiled revolutionary, Giuseppe Garibaldi, the swashbuckling general with a history of guerrilla warfare in South America. Garibaldi arrived in Rome with a small band of followers, dressed in red shirts and bearing the romantic air of soldier poets. Though under-equipped and poorly trained, they were fiercely loyal. As the French attacked the Roman walls on April 30, Garibaldi led a daring counterassault, forcing the enemy back to the coast. For a moment, the Republic held. Citizens rejoiced, bells rang, Mazzini gave speeches filled with hope. But he knew the French would return, and next time, they would not underestimate the defenders. An unresolved question. Inside the city, the spirit of the Republic burned brightly, perhaps too brightly. Mazzini rejected offers to negotiate. He refused to compromise on principle. Garibaldi, though brave, lacked numbers and supplies. The Roman Republic stood alone, its fate hanging on whether the people's will could withstand the world's armies. Could idealism hold a city against empire? Could words and courage stop cannon and steel? The answer was forming just beyond the horizon. The French were coming back with siege guns, reinforcements, and the will to restore a pope. In early June 1849, the fate of the Roman Republic began to harden into the stone of siege lines and the thunder of artillery. What had started as an idealistic experiment, a city governed by principles, led by philosophers and patriots, was now encircled by foreign armies, under threat of obliteration. From the north, Austrian forces menaced the Roman countryside. From the west, 30,000 French troops, now reinforced and rearmed, closed in under General Nicolas Oudinot. Inside the city, Giuseppe Mazzini and Giuseppe Garibaldi steeled themselves for a final stand. Rome was about to become a battleground between idealism and pragmatism, between vision and violence. The calm before the sea. Following their earlier defeat in April, the French had withdrawn temporarily. But now, President Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte, eager to appease Catholic conservatives in France, ordered a full-scale campaign to restore Pope Pius IX to his temporal throne. Despite Mazzini's overtures and appeals to French republicanism, diplomacy failed. In early June, Oudinot's forces returned with siege equipment and a mandate: crush the Roman Republic. Inside Rome, the situation grew tense, but Mazzini, ever the idealist, refused to evacuate or negotiate. He believed the Republic would inspire Europe. He hoped the French working class would revolt against the intervention. He trusted the people of Rome to endure, as ancient Romans once had. Garibaldi, by contrast, understood the military reality. He fortified the city, trained volunteers, and planned guerrilla tactics. The two men, though united in cause, represented two halves of the revolutionary psyche. One dreaming of a new world, the other fighting to keep the dream alive. The siege begins. On June 3, 1849, French forces began their assault on the Janiculum Hill, the western high ground overlooking the city. The fighting was brutal. Artillery pounded ancient walls and villas. Garibaldi, red-shirted volunteers staged daring counterattacks. Women, children, and students joined the defense, ferrying water, tending to the wounded, and even fighting. Garibaldi's men fought with fury and improvisation, often outnumbered but never outwilled. The city's defenders saw themselves not as soldiers, but as citizens of a free republic defending their home. Yet the French numbers told a different story. Day by day, Rome's defenses weakened. By late June, the city was exhausted. Food supplies dwindled. Medical care collapsed. Morale began to falter under the relentless bombardment. Still, Mazzini refused surrender. He issued proclamations. He wrote articles. He held fast to the belief that the Republic must stand, even if only as an example to history. Inside the Republic, as the siege wore on, life within the walls took on a strange, almost sacred character. The Roman Republic, even under siege, continued to function. Public schools remained open, with lessons taught between bombardments. Debates continued in the assembly, though sometimes interrupted by cannon fire. Mazzini held daily meetings, writing policy in the early hours before gunfire resumed. It was not anarchy. It was an experiment in civic virtue under impossible strain. One witness wrote, "Rome under Mazzini was like Athens under Pericles, if Pericles had been shelled daily by monarchists." The city became a kind of martyr state, brilliant, ephemeral, and increasingly doomed. Garibaldi's last stand. By the end of June, it was clear that the Republic could not survive. On June 29, French forces breached the Porta San Pancrazio. Fierce street fighting followed, but the outcome was certain. On July 1, the Assembly convened. Mazzini proposed withdrawal, but many still hoped for a miracle. On July 2, the Assembly voted to cease resistance. Garibaldi, refusing to surrender, gathered a force of about 4,000 men and offered to march out of the city, not as a soldier of fortune, but as the defender of a betrayed people. That night, he and his volunteers slipped out under cover of darkness, heading north into the hills. Many would never return. The end of the Republic. On July 3, 1849, French forces entered Rome. There were no victory parades, no mass executions. The French restored order with relative restraint, knowing the world was watching. The Papal States were re-established, and in April 1850, Pope Pius IX returned his moderate reputation forever shattered. From that point forward, he ruled as a reactionary monarch, cracking down on civil liberties and opposing Italian unification with increasing fervor. Mazzini, devastated but not defeated, returned to exile. In his journal, he wrote, "We failed, yes, but we failed with dignity. Our failure is a seed." An unfinished revolution. The Roman Republic had lasted 143 days. It had written one of the world's first democratic constitutions with universal male suffrage, free press, civil equality, and religious freedom. It had attempted to reconcile faith with liberty, nationhood with republicanism, and philosophy with governance. And it had done so while surrounded by enemies, starved of support, and battered by superior armies. It was a republic of dreamers, but also doers, administrators, and teachers. Its fall was not a failure of incompetence, but of isolation. An open question. Mazzini believed that the Roman Republic would become a beacon, that the world would see its sacrifice and rise in solidarity. But the world did not. France crushed it to appease voters. Austria looked on with satisfaction. Even many in Italy stayed silent. And so the Roman Republic became a ghost, a vision of what might have been, a flicker of freedom extinguished by geopolitics. Is it better to live briefly in full liberty, or to endure long under quiet submission. The fall of the Roman Republic in July 1849 marked not just the collapse of a government, but the extinguishing of a dream, one that had burned brightly, if briefly, over the 7 hills of Rome. For those who had lived, fought, and believed in it, the Republic became not a failure but a testament, a symbol of what might be, given different times, different allies, or perhaps a different world. And for Giuseppe Mazzini, the collapse of the Republic was both a personal tragedy and a spiritual trial. He had seen his lifelong ideals take form in stone and law only to see them crushed under the boots of foreign soldiers. But he did not give up. The Republic was gone, yes, but the idea of Italy, free and united, had not died. Mazzini in exile. After the Republic's fall, Mazzini returned to London, where he had spent much of his adult life in exile. He resumed his role as agitator, writer, and visionary, sending out letters, essays, and appeals across Europe. He continued to lead Young Italy, his secret revolutionary network, now scattered across the continent. But the failure in Rome had changed him. Where once he had spoken of near-inevitable triumph, he now tempered his tone with the weight of realpolitik and loss. Still, his belief in the moral mission of Italy never wavered. He wrote, "The Roman Republic has fallen, but it has not died. Its soul lives in the conscience of men." Mazzini would spend the rest of his life trying to rekindle that conscience. Garibaldi's journey continues. Giuseppe Garibaldi, too, escaped Rome with his ragged column of volunteers. His journey would become legendary. Hunted across the Apennines by French, Austrian, and Papal troops. His wife Anita, pregnant and ill, died during the escape. His forces dwindled, starved, and were scattered. But Garibaldi survived, eventually fleeing to Genoa, then North Africa, then New York, before returning to South America and later rising again as a hero in the Italian Wars of Unification. Unlike Mazzini, Garibaldi became a national icon, eventually commanding armies in the name of Italian unity, albeit under the monarchy of Victor Emmanuel II, a compromise that would later divide him from his former comrade. Still, the memory of his defense of Rome in 1849 would forever burn in the hearts of patriots. Pius IX's reactionary rule. Meanwhile, the Pope returned to Rome, not as a reformer, but as a reactionary autocrat. Pius IX, once hailed as a liberal hope, had been deeply shaken by the revolution. His exile in Gaeta had confirmed his fears. Liberty, republicanism, and nationalism were threats not only to monarchy, but to the church itself. Upon his return, he reasserted absolute papal authority. Civic freedoms were rolled back. Political opponents were imprisoned, exiled, or silenced. The Papal States became a police regime, patrolled by foreign troops. In the years that followed, Pius IX would become increasingly intransigent, culminating in his declaration of papal infallibility in 1870. The once liberal pope had become a symbol of ecclesiastical absolutism. The Roman Republic had frightened him and in doing so, had reshaped the papacy for decades. The long road to unification. Though the Republic had fallen, the larger cause of Italian unification would not die. The 1850s and 60s would see renewed wars against Austria, diplomatic maneuvering by Cavour, heroic campaigns by Garibaldi in the south, the gradual consolidation of Italy under Piedmontese monarchy. Rome, however, remained a problem, still held by the Pope, still protected by French troops. It would take until 1870, during the chaos of the Franco-Prussian War, for Italian troops to finally enter Rome unopposed and declare it the capital of a new, unified Italy. Ironically, the Italian state that emerged was not the republic Mazzini had dreamed of, but a constitutional monarchy, cautious and conservative. Mazzini, disappointed but dignified, withdrew from politics. He died in 1872, never having seen his vision fully realized. But others remembered. Legacy of the Republic. The Roman Republic of 1849 became more than a short-lived regime. It became a foundational myth for Italian republicanism. Its constitution, though short-lived, inspired generations of reformers. Its defense, though ultimately futile, became a model of citizen courage. Its leaders, though flawed, became symbols of civic virtue. Mazzini would be hailed posthumously as a father of the nation. Garibaldi, more popular in life, would become an international revolutionary hero. Even the Republic's failures taught vital lessons. That unity without power is fragile. That morality without diplomacy is vulnerable. That revolutions must survive not only the battlefield but the world beyond it. A final reflection. The Roman Republic was not meant to last. It was born in crisis, led by philosophers, and crushed by politics it could not control. And yet, its legacy endures not because of what it achieved, but because of what it tried to be. A republic of virtue in a time of empire, a voice of freedom in the land of ancient thrones. In the quiet streets of modern Rome, few traces remain. A plaque here, a statue there. But the spirit of 1849 lives on in every attempt to forge a republic not through conquest, but through principle. And so we ask, is it possible to build a republic on ideals alone? Or must every noble dream one day confront the world as it is not as we wish it to be?